All right, let's dive deep into biological altruism.
Okay.
We're looking at this Stanford Encyclopedia philosophy entry on this.
Okay.
And it's a pretty interesting topic, I think, for you especially.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fascinating one and something that
Yeah.
really gets to the heart of a lot of philosophical questions.
Yeah, and I mean, biological altruism, it almost sounds like an oxymoron.
It does, doesn't it?
Right,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
if the goal of life is to survive and reproduce,
Right.
how can there be such a thing as biological altruism?
Well, that's the big question, right?
Yeah.
And it really comes down to how we're defining altruism.
Yeah.
Um, and so when we talk about biological altruism, we're not necessarily talking about,
Okay.
warm, fuzzy feelings or intentions or anything like that.
Right. Yeah.
We're talking about the effects of a behavior.
Yeah.
So an altruistic behavior in a biological context
Okay.
is one that increases the reproductive fitness of the recipient of the behavior while decreasing the reproductive fitness of the actor.
So the actor is the one doing the altruistic behavior.
Exactly.
Okay. And reproductive fitness is their ability to pass on their genes.
Exactly. Yeah, the ability to survive and reproduce and pass on their genes.
Okay. So it's not about intention. It's just simply
Right.
about the outcome.
It's about the measurable outcomes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So then how could this have evolved?
Right.
Right. Because it seems like if you're reducing your own ability to pass on your genes,
Yeah.
that should put you at an evolutionary disadvantage.
Absolutely. So this is the puzzle, right?
Yeah.
This is the Darwinian puzzle of altruism.
Yeah.
And there have been various attempts to try to explain this.
Yeah.
One of the early ones is the idea of group selection.
Okay.
And so the idea here is that even though altruists might be at a disadvantage within their own group,
Okay.
a group with a lot of altruists
Right.
might be at an advantage compared to a group of more selfish individuals.
So it's like they can outcompete
Right.
the other group by working together.
Yeah, it's like imagine a group of animals that
Oh, yeah.
share food with each other or they protect each other from predators.
Yeah.
They might be at a disadvantage, if there's a selfish individual who just takes
Yeah.
and doesn't give back, but the group as a whole is going to be more successful
Yeah.
if they're all cooperating.
So the group benefits even if the individuals
Right.
sometimes be.
Exactly. And that benefit to the group can translate into, greater survival,
Yeah.
greater reproduction, and ultimately, that group is going to spread its genes more
Okay.
than the group of selfish individuals.
Right. So the group selection is saying that the group itself is being selected for.
That's the idea. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I'm just thinking back to my philosophy of biology class, and I remember there were some pretty serious problems with group selection.
There are. Yeah.
Yeah, what was that all about?
Yeah. So one of the main problems with group selection
What?
is this idea of subversion from within.
Okay.
So you can imagine a group that's, doing really well because they're all cooperating.
Okay.
They're all altruistic, but then a selfish mutant arises.
Right.
And that selfish individual can start to exploit the altruism of others.
So they benefit from the group, but they don't contribute.
They get all the benefits without paying the costs.
Yeah.
And because they're not paying the costs, they're likely to be more reproductively successful.
Right. So they pass on those selfish genes.
Exactly. And so over time, those selfish genes can spread through the population.
Yeah.
And eventually that altruistic group can be undermined from within.
So it kind of falls apart.
It can. Yeah.
Okay. So group selection, maybe not the best explanation.
Right. It has some serious problems.
Yeah. So is there a better one?
Well, there is a very influential theory
Okay.
that came about in the 1960s called kin selection or inclusive fitness theory.
Okay. Kin selection. So that's about family.
It is, yeah. It's about the idea that you can increase the success of your genes
Right.
by helping relatives.
Because they share your genes.
Exactly.
Okay.
So even if you're not reproducing yourself,
Right.
you can still increase the representation of your genes in the next generation.
By helping your siblings.
Exactly.
Okay.
By helping your cousins, your nieces, nephews, and so on.
So it's like an indirect way of
Right.
passing on your genes?
It's like investing in a family business.
Oh, okay. I like that.
Yeah, you're not directly profiting from every decision, but the overall success of the business
Right.
ultimately benefits everyone who holds shares.
Okay. So how do we actually calculate this or measure it? Is there some kind of equation or
There is.
something?
Yeah, so W.D. Hamilton came up with this very elegant equation called Hamilton's rule.
Okay.
And the equation is pretty simple. It says that the benefit to the recipient of an altruistic act
Okay.
multiplied by the coefficient of relatedness.
So how closely related they are.
Exactly. Has to be greater than the cost to the altruist.
Okay.
So in other words, for an altruistic behavior to evolve the benefit to the recipient weighted by the relatedness
Right.
has to outweigh the cost to the actor.
Okay. So like closer relatives,
Yes.
more likely to help.
Exactly. The closer the relatedness, the more likely you are to see altruistic behavior,
Okay.
even if the cost is pretty high.
So are there any examples of this in nature?
Oh, tons of examples, yeah.
Like where?
So one classic example is helper birds.
Okay.
So these are birds that often they're young birds.
Okay.
And instead of going off and breeding themselves,
Okay.
they'll stay and help their parents raise their younger siblings.
So they're helping raise like their nieces and nephews.
Well, actually, in this case, they're usually helping raise their full siblings.
Okay. Full siblings even closer.
Even closer, yeah.
Okay.
And so, they're giving up their own reproductive opportunities,
Right.
but they're helping to increase the survival and reproduction of their siblings who share a lot of their genes.
And what about those insects that like ants and bees?
Yeah, social insects.
Yeah, where they have like the workers that don't reproduce.
Yeah, that's an even more extreme example of kin selection.
Because they're giving up everything.
They're completely sterile.
Yeah.
They're not reproducing at all.
Right.
But they're helping to raise the queen's offspring.
Okay.
Which are their siblings, or in some cases, even more closely related.
And so that's benefiting them, even though they're not directly.
Right, because they're helping to spread the genes that they share with the queen and her offspring.
Okay, so, I mean, this is all very fascinating, but I do have to say, I'm a little uncomfortable with this language of, like, selfish genes.
I understand, yeah.
I mean, does that mean that we're all just puppets of our genes and we don't have any free will and...
Right, so it's important to remember that, the selfish gene is a metaphor.
Okay.
It's a way of understanding evolution from the gene's perspective.
Okay.
It doesn't mean that we're, consciously controlled by our genes.
Right.
Or that we don't have free will.
Yeah.
It just means that from an evolutionary perspective, any trait that evolves, including altruism, can ultimately be explained as a way for genes to increase their representation in the next generation.
So our genes are trying to make more copies of themselves.
In a sense, yeah. That's the way.
Okay.
That's the way evolution works.
Okay, so it's not that we're being selfish. It's just that our genes are kind of...
It's a way of understanding the process.
Okay.
Yeah.
So kinship is definitely like a big driver of this altruism. But are there cases where altruism happens?
Yeah.
Outside of family?
Absolutely.
Yeah, like what?
Yeah, so kinship is probably the most significant factor.
Okay.
But there are other mechanisms that can contribute to the evolution of altruism.
Right.
So, for example, shared environments or preferences can sometimes lead to altruism.
So, like, if everyone's living in the same environment, they might be more likely to help each other.
So if a gene that promotes altruism also happens to make animals prefer a certain type of nesting site, then those altruistic individuals are going to end up clustering together.
Right, and they're going to help each other out.
And they're more likely to interact with each other and help each other out.
Right, even if they're not related.
Even if they're not related exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's sort of like, social clubs or communities that form around shared interests or values.
Right.
People are drawn together by common ground, and it can foster a sense of mutual support and cooperation.
Okay, so it's not always just about family. It could be about these larger...
It could be about other factors.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So we've got this idea of altruism and how it can evolve.
Yeah.
But to really understand how cooperation can emerge, I think we need to get into another concept.
Okay.
And that's game theory.
Okay.
And specifically, the prisoner's dilemma.
Ah, yes, the prisoner's dilemma.
Yeah.
A classic thought experiment.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good way to illustrate, the challenge of cooperation.
Yeah. So the prisoner's dilemma is basically this scenario.
Okay.
Where you have two individuals who are arrested for a crime.
Okay.
And they're interrogated separately.
Okay.
And each prisoner has two options.
Okay.
They can either betray the other prisoner.
Okay.
Or they can stay silent.
Okay.
And the outcome for each prisoner depends on what the other prisoner does.
Right. So it's like the strategic...
Exactly. It's a strategic interaction.
Yeah.
Where, the best outcome for both of them is if they both stay silent.
They both cooperate.
They both cooperate, but there's always this temptation...
To betray the other?
To betray the other, right? Because if you betray the other and they stay silent...
Yeah, you get off scot-free.
You get the best possible outcome for yourself.
Right. But if you both betray each other,
then you both end up worse off
than if you had cooperated in the first place.
Exactly.
Right. So how does this relate to the evolution of altruism?
Well, if we think of altruism as a form of cooperation, the prisoner's dilemma kind of shows us why altruism can be hard to evolve, especially in one-off encounters.
So if you're only going to meet this other individual once,
right,
you're not going to see them again.
The most rational thing to do is to defect.
Just to be selfish?
To betray, to be selfish.
Okay.
But of course, if you interact with that individual repeatedly, then things change.
So like in a community or something.
Exactly.
Okay.
So if there's repeated interactions, then the dynamics of the game change.
Okay.
Because now you have to worry about the possibility of retaliation. If you cheat this time...
Right. They might not help you next time.
Exactly. They might not cooperate with you next time.
Yeah.
So that possibility of future cooperation and the threat of punishment for cheating can create an environment where altruism can actually flourish.
So it's almost like building up a reputation.
It is, yeah. It's like building trust and reputation within a community.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so that brings us to this idea of reciprocal altruism.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we've talked about a lot of different things here.
We have.
We've talked about different types of cooperation.
Yeah.
We've talked about the challenges of defining altruism.
Right.
But before we dive into this reciprocal altruism, I think it's important for our philosopher listener that we take some time to clarify some of the ambiguities surrounding this whole idea of altruism.
Absolutely. I think that's a crucial step.
Yeah.
Okay, so one really important distinction to make is between altruism and other types of cooperative behavior, like mutual benefit.
Okay, so in mutual benefit, both parties are benefiting.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a win-win situation.
Okay.
So, a classic example of this is, two oxen pulling a plow together.
Right.
They both benefit from the shared effort.
Yeah.
Right? Neither one is really sacrificing anything.
So their fitness is increasing.
Exactly. Yeah, their fitness is increasing.
Okay.
And so this is a very easy to understand kind of cooperation from an evolutionary perspective.
Yeah, because it's just straight up
It's
self-interest.
Yeah, it's just aligned self-interest.
Yeah.
And we see this all the time in nature.
Yeah, like herds of zebras or
exactly.
flocks of birds.
Yeah, each individual benefits from the safety and vigilance of the group.
Yeah.
And there's no real incentive to cheat or be selfish because the best strategy for each individual is to participate.
Okay.
So that's mutual benefit. Now, contrasting that with altruism, things get a little bit more tricky. And to make things even more complicated, there's also a distinction between strong altruism.
Okay, strong altruism.
And weak altruism.
Weak altruism. So there's like levels to this.
There are shades of altruism.
Okay, so what's strong altruism?
So strong altruism is the kind that we've been mostly talking about.
Okay.
Where there's a clear decrease in the altruist's absolute fitness.
So they're losing something.
You're giving up something.
Okay.
They're giving up food resources, reproductive opportunities to benefit another individual.
So like those worker ants?
Exactly.
That's strong altruism.
That's a classic example of strong altruism.
Okay. So then what is weak altruism?
So weak altruism is a little bit more murky.
Okay.
So in weak altruism, the action still benefits the recipient more than it benefits the actor.
Okay.
But the actor also experiences some benefit.
Okay. So they're still getting something out of it.
They're still getting something out of it. Yeah. It's kind of like, helping a friend move.
Right.
You're putting in the effort.
Yeah.
But you might also get a free pizza and some good company out of it.
Right. So it's not total loss.
It's not a total loss, yeah. And so there's actually some debate about whether weak altruism should even be considered.
Right, because it's almost like it's beneficial to them to do it.
It's kind of like enlightened self-interest.
Right.
You're ultimately acting to maximize your own gains.
Yeah.
Even if those gains are delayed or less substantial.
Than the person you're helping.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's a bit of a gray area.
Yeah, so where do we draw the line then?
That's a good question, and I don't think there's an easy answer.
Right. Is it like a spectrum, or is it like...
Yeah, I think it is more of a spectrum.
Sure.
There's not always a clear dividing line between self-interest and altruism. And, from an evolutionary perspective, you could argue that any behavior that ultimately increases an individual's fitness could be seen as serving self-interest.
Even if it looks altruistic.
Even if it looks altruistic on the surface.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's kind of a mind-bending.
It is.
Yeah.
It's a little bit humbling to think about it that way.
Yeah.
But, it doesn't necessarily diminish the significance
right.
of those actions or the emotions that drive them.
Yeah, it's just a different lens.
Yeah, just a different
through which to view them.
Way of looking at it. Yeah. Okay, so we've got strong altruism, weak altruism, and then there's this idea of like the time scale.
Right.
Right, because sometimes a behavior might look altruistic in the short term.
Exactly.
But then in the long term, it's actually beneficial.
Yeah, so the distinction between short-term and long-term fitness is really important here.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how does that play out?
So, imagine a bird that gives an alarm call to warn its flock of an approaching predator.
Okay.
Now, in the short term, that bird is putting itself at risk.
Right, because it's drawing attention to itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if that behavior strengthens the group's cohesion.
Right, and they all survive.
Yeah. It could ultimately benefit that individual in the long term.
Because the group is stronger.
Exactly, because the group is stronger.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about, like, if you're sharing food with someone?
Yeah, so that's another good example.
Right.
A primate that shares food with a non-relative.
Okay.
In the short term, they're losing out on those resources.
And they're giving up.
They're giving up food.
Their own food.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if that act of generosity builds a social bond.
Right.
That leads to future cooperation and support.
Right. So you might get paid back later.
Okay. Yeah. So it's not always about immediate gains.
It's at the long game.
It's about playing the long game.
Okay. Yeah.
And that can be hard to
It can be. Yeah.
measure, I guess, or figure out.
It can be tricky to tease apart.
Yeah.
Those short-term costs and long-term benefits.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about all these different...
Well, we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah. Types of cooperative behavior.
Yeah.
Strong altruism, weak altruism.
Yeah.
Mutual benefit.
Uh-huh.
But there's this one we haven't really gotten into yet.
Right.
And that's reciprocal altruism.
Reciprocal altruism, yeah.
Yeah, and this is the one where it's...
This is the one where it's like, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how does that work?
So reciprocal altruism is really interesting.
Okay.
Because it offers an explanation for altruism between unrelated individuals, even individuals of different species.
Okay.
So it's not based on kinship.
Right.
It's not necessarily based on immediate mutual benefit.
Okay.
It's based on this expectation of future reciprocation.
Okay, so you're expecting to get paid back.
Yeah. You're expecting to get paid back at some point down the line.
Okay.
Yeah, and so this requires individuals to be able to keep track of past interactions.
Right, so they have to remember who helped them.
Yeah, they have to remember who helped them, who cheated them.
Yeah.
And it also requires a social environment where repeated encounters are likely.
So you're going to see these individuals again.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's like, building trust.
You're like a community.
Yeah, like a community.
Okay.
And we see some really cool examples of reciprocal altruism in nature.
Like what?
So remember those vampire bats?
Oh, yeah. The vampire bats?
They not only share blood with their kin,
okay, yeah.
but they also share blood with unrelated individuals who have helped them out in the past.
So if I give you blood today,
you
give me blood tomorrow.
Exactly. Yeah, they're kind of keeping track of...
Like a mental ledger?
Yeah, a mental ledger of favors owed and favors received.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow, and so it's not even just...
And it's not even just limited to vampire bats. Okay.
Cleaner fish?
Oh, yeah, the cleaner fish.
Those little fish that remove parasites from larger fish.
Right.
They engage in a form of interspecies reciprocal altruism.
Oh, wow. So even between different...
Even between different species.
Species, they're cooperating.
Yeah. So they provide a valuable service to the larger fish.
Right. They clean them.
They get rid of the parasites.
Yeah.
And in return, the larger fish often protect the cleaner fish from predators.
Even if it means
delaying their own escape.
They'll protect the cleaner fish.
Yeah. So it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, that is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So even though they don't even speak the same language, they're able to cooperate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a testament to the power of, mutual benefit.
Yeah.
Even when those immediate gains aren't apparent.
Okay, so I guess the big question then is, does knowing all of this, does knowing that maybe these behaviors are ultimately driven by self-interest, does that make them less real or less valuable That's a really good question.
Yeah, does it devalue altruism?
Yeah, that's a question that I think is at the heart of a lot of the debate.
Yeah.
Around biological altruism and its implications for human morality.
Okay, so we'll have to get into that.
We'll have to dive into that.
In the next part.
In the next part,
right? Right, sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've been on this journey exploring biological altruism.
We have.
And I have to say, I'm still kind of grappling with this question of, does understanding the evolutionary basis for altruism, does that make it any less real or less valuable?
It's a great question, and it's one that I think a lot of people struggle with when they first encounter these ideas.
Yeah, it's like if we can explain it away as just being a strategy for survival, does that mean it's not really altruism?
Right, and I think the key here is to remember that biological explanations and philosophical or ethical considerations of altruism are operating on different levels of analysis.
So it's like we're talking about two different things.
Yeah, it's kind of like apples and oranges. You know, they're both fruit, but they have different properties, different qualities.
Yeah.
And so trying to judge one by the standards of the other doesn't really make sense.
Okay, so when we're talking about biological altruism, we're really just talking about how those behaviors could have evolved.
Exactly, yeah. We're talking about the ultimate fitness consequences of those behaviors.
So whether it helps them pass on their genes.
Right, it's about the effects of the behavior on reproductive success.
Okay, but it doesn't tell us anything about, like, their intention.
Exactly. Yeah, it doesn't tell us anything about the proximate mechanisms, the motivations, the conscious experiences.
So, like, for humans, it's not like we're doing a calculation every time we do something nice for someone. Right,
exactly. Yeah, we're not like, oh, let me calculate my coefficient of relatedness to this person before I decide whether to help them. You know, we have emotions, we have empathy, we have moral values.
And those things factor into our decisions.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think, you know, this is where the selfish gene metaphor, while it's helpful for understanding evolution from a gene's perspective, can be a little bit misleading if we take it too literally or we try to apply it too broadly.
Right, because it's not like our genes are little puppet masters.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's not like they're controlling our every move.
Okay.
You know, we are more than just vessels for our genes. We have the capacity for, you know, reflection, for empathy, for moral reasoning.
Yeah, we can make choices that go beyond just self-interest.
We can make choices that seem to go against our own self-interest.
Or even our genetic interests.
Even our genetic interests, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So I guess the point is that understanding the evolutionary origins of altruism doesn't negate the possibility that there can be genuine anarchism.
I think that's a really important point. Yeah, it doesn't mean that, you know, just because something has an evolutionary explanation, it's not real or it's not meaningful.
Right. Like just because we understand how a painting is made doesn't make the painting any less beautiful.
Exactly. Yeah. It's just giving us a deeper understanding of the process.
Okay. So, I mean, that's actually kind of a hopeful thought.
It is, yeah.
It means that even though we've evolved to be selfish in a sense, we're also capable of
great kindness, of genuine concern for others. And I think, you know, those capacities for cooperation and compassion have probably played a really important role in our success as a species.
Right. Because we can work together.
Exactly. We can work together. We can help each other.
Yeah.
And that's given us a huge advantage.
Yeah. So the big question then is, how do we cultivate that?
Right.
How do we make sure that...
Yeah. How do we nurture those capacities?
Yeah.
How do we create a world where altruism can flourish?
Yeah, that's a good question for our philosophers.
Yeah, that's a question for the philosophers.
Yeah.
And for all of us.
Yeah. And I think that's a good place to leave it.
I think so.
So we've explored biological altruism.
We have.
We've looked at how it can evolve.
Yeah.
We've talked about the different types of altruism. And we've even gotten into some of the philosophical implications.
Right.
And I think the big takeaway for me is that even though we live in a world that's often driven by competition and self-interest, there's still room for kindness and compassion.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a really beautiful thought.
It is.
So until next time, keep diving deep.
Keep exploring.
Keep questioning.
And keep wondering.
Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.